Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Cuban. I'm the president of the St. Louis chapter of the PRSA, and we have a lot of different chapters that are involved with this chapter webinar series program. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, and we have Dan Lester and Burnéa Lester. I'll start with Burnea first. She's an evolution and learning manager at the University of Missouri St. Louis Community Innovation and Action Center. And then Dan is Clayco's Director of Field Diversity, Inclusion, and Culture, where he focuses on culture of job sites and making them more inclusive. And both Burnea and Dan actually are co-founders of Engine Media Group. And that's where I met Dan for the first time about 10 years ago when I bought, I think it was, what was it, Dan, a Canon XL2 from you?
Yeah.
That was many generations ago with cameras. But both of you are the co-founders of the Art of Adaption training system, which is a platform for teaching and training diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Burnea's expertise is includes project and relational management, strategic planning, data systems, and higher education administration. And Dan's passion has been recognized in St. Louis community and nationally. He's also known to be a diverse business leader, an inclusion champion, and one of the top 100 HR influencers of 2020. So if you're not connected with both Burnea and Dan, please connect with them on LinkedIn and social media. They're always showcasing a host of talents and expertise on their social media feeds. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you guys.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. So today we will be talking about unpacking the role of media in the progression of the diversity and inclusion narrative. So what we'll be getting in today is really looking how this concept of diversity, equity, inclusion plays a part in the media and really our role as we push this narrative forward, as we communicate to those, whether we are in mainstream media or doing public relations as well. A little bit about me before I turn it over to my husband and let him introduce himself. So my background is in broadcast journalism. After changing my major about 7 times from computer science because I wasn't good in math, I decided that maybe, I thought to myself, what's my favorite thing to do? And it was watching television. So I got into broadcast journalism, really delved into the journalism side of things. And then it led me to go get my master's degree in media communication and media literacy. It was going to either be media literacy or public relations. I chose media literacy because I wanted to understand the psychology behind the media messages that we send through our lighting, through the color that we choose for pictures, our photojournalism, the words that we say, how we communicate. And so I wanted to get into that. And it is definitely a passion of mine as well. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Dan Lester.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Lester. I am so honored to be here. Thank you, Chris, and the PRSA for having us here today. It is certainly a pleasure. My love for media grew in high school, where it was, I went to a high school that had a video technology center, digital days, and we were working on those big tape decks from one to the other, and you had to do your transitions and by moving the little pendulum handle there and everything from that point on, and so that was the ticket for me to get to college and to create my highlight films, and I did them for my team and other folks. And so I began to love media from that perspective. And so my wife and I had an opportunity to start our own company back in '09. And I met Chris soon thereafter, but it's been a pleasure and a privilege to be a part of this. But media is really the driving force of everything that we do. And that's going from there. So I'll stay done with that. That's enough about that. The art of adaption. So the art of adaption, it really comes from a process where we're really thinking about, we have what we call the inclusion, design, build process. And what it really does is, in my industry of construction, you will often hear what's called design build. And when a contractor says they are a design build contractor, for example, I work for Clayco, and Clayco is a design build contractor. So when a company says they are a design build, it means that they only start the project with 30% of the drawings completed. But then they get 30% of the drawings completed, and then they go and they solicit other individuals who have expertise in those areas so that the project can start quicker, and we can begin moving on the first 30%. But while the first 30% is being completed, those partners that they've went and taken on are, and the experts in those individual spaces are now included in the conversation, and they can design it because they're the ones building it. And that way it allows a faster pace of construction, a more efficient pace of construction, especially in times like these when we're kind of after the onset of COVID-19, and a lot of construction companies have stopped doing work. But we wanted to make sure that that's a fast process. It makes it good for lean construction and things of that nature. So we've taken that kind of ideology and gone to the inclusion design build process, where we basically will help you come in and figure out what's an inclusion like. So we'll kind of set the framework of inclusion and then help you find community stakeholders or partners within your organization or within your circle of influence, depending on what you're doing, that will allow you to help build that out so that you can have a complete process that is inclusive of everybody, but you don't have to wait till it started. Oftentimes, diversity and inclusion conversations, we forget that other voices need to be heard. And that's kind of why we're on the conversation that we're on today, because those voices have not become amplified. Folks have not become amplified, and they're not having gotten their opportunity to get a chance to say their voice. And what we've seen, which we'll talk about here in a minute afterwards, is that now those voices demanded, and even the social narratives that we've seen really since the onset of social media, early 2010, 2005, and Facebook kind of came around, all those things have shifted the way we do business and all those types of things. So basically, this is a way for us to kind of help you take yourself through an adaptive process. It is adaptive. A lot of times folks want to make diversity and inclusion changes in full sweeps, and that's just not sound logic, because any significant change, I know in my industry, construction, we have very razor thin margins. We're at like 2 to 3% on a job. So we might be doing $300 million project, but the profit margin is 3% on that project. And so we're not really making that much money. So the biggest threat to that is change. And so change is huge. A lot of us are reluctant to change, but we recognize that the only thing constant in the world is change. And so what we want to do is walk you through that so that you can do what's best for you. Everybody doesn't start at the same place. Everybody doesn't enter at the same point. But when they do get in, we have to acknowledge that. We don't ridicule, we become gracious, and we help those individuals and those organizations to where they would like to be and to where they want to go.
Awesome. So kind of what we're going to do today, our agenda, our outcomes, they kind of go hand in hand. The first thing that we're going to do is understand the power of core values. This is a personal reflection of yourself. We're going to get into that. Next, we're going to understand where you are in the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation versus the industry as well. So we're going to take a snapshot of where we are, what influences us, and look at our industry as communicators as well. And then we're going to identify opportunities in small adaptive steps that we can give, or that we can take to make powerful moves, because enough adaptive steps will equal the change that we want to see and have that impact in our surroundings and our environments, organizations, and communities as well. So we're going to talk about understand the power of core values.
So when we talk about core values are the very epitome of who you are. We don't know who you are until you tell me what your values are. Once you've identified your values, and a lot of adults I talk to, and when we do these exercises with professionals, when I do it with students, whoever I would do these exercises with, organizations, they have their core values, but they haven't really started to look at what they truly mean and what they say. Your core values are what tells me what you're going to do in a moment of crisis, how you're going to respond. So if you tell me that your core value is let's say the golden rule, and you treat others the way that you would like to be treated. That means in your decision making, in your writing, in your journalism, in your PR, whatever you do, your things should be added to that. The thing about core values, though, is that those are the people that we want to be. Our core values are who we want to be, who we strive to be. Those are the things that our parents, grandparents, our community, they taught us. The values that were ingrained in us about treating folks right, the values of getting more perspective, even the values of diversity and inclusion, which haven't always been there, but for some, there's a lot of people come about faith. They come with their family, and they come with all different types of things. One of mine is competition. It seems like a weird one, but competition for me is a value, because for me, when I'm competing with myself, that breeds excellence. I don't compete against you or compete against anybody else. I compete against myself, trying to be the best version more and more and more. But identification of who you are is so very important. And even the organizations you represent and having them identify, or even clients you may represent, the identification has to be there, because when folks start to identify who they are, then it helps them understand how they can plot a pathway to move forward. But you cannot plot a pathway moving forward if you have not first determined who you are, and then you will determine where you are in that space. But without knowing who you are, everything you do will be without reason. And oftentimes in the diversity, inclusion, and equity conversations, what we see is organizations who throw money at problems, who throw money at who will hire somebody on a whim, because now what we've seen, you've even look at the news over since the end of May, when George Floyd happened, and what organizations started to do with the BLM statements and with hiring people and becoming in action. The question is, was that part of your value system? If it was part of your value system, great. Or have your values adjusted? And how are you going to do that to make sure it is continuous in your value process? Because if it's not a core value, you won't measure it. If it's not a core value, you won't do it. This is the only place in our industry, or in any industry you will see in this field, where you see that folks don't have goals, they don't measure it, they don't have metrics, so they just throw money at it. They just throw a program out there and they'll say, oh, we wanted to go hire more minorities, we wanted to go hire more women, or we wanted to focus on the LGBTQ plus community, or veterans, or younger, or whatever the case may be, or even elderly. We wanted to do those things, and they had great intentions, but they had no goals behind it. And if it's not part of your business acumen in these types of environments, then it won't work.
Thank you so much. Because those core values are so important, like Daniel said, it is who we want to be on our best day, right? We always want to show up as our best selves. But let's take a moment and really dissect some of the biases that affect us as communicators, right? So whether you are a person who puts the media out, a part of the mainstream, whether you're in PR, whether you do print, advertising, marketing, whatever you do, we are all influenced by the mainstream media personally, right? So you have your core value. So my core value is justice and love. And so when I inhale media, I am inhaling things from the mainstream that could play towards my core value, even if my perspective might be wrong, right? So we're all influenced by the media. Now, to make our jobs even harder as mass communicators, those who do our due diligence to create the narrative, now we're influenced by social media influences. We've seen it before where, one thing happens and there's complete outrage. We've seen it with everything from the coronavirus to Black Lives Matter, the social media, we're hearing voices. Companies are being influenced by this as well. So we're influenced by the social media as communicators as well. Another thing that influences our purview when we're communicating is our personal lived experiences. No one can discount what you've experienced in your life that shapes, right, your view of the social constructs of this society and of this world. So we have our personal lived experience, and then we have our personal implicit and explicit bias. So one thing that me and Daniel always commit to is to be completely authentic and real. We do not take ourselves seriously. So when we get to some of the biases, when we look at some photos later, you know, I'll discuss some of the things that I struggle with as a Black female. And Daniel will do like kind as a Black male. But all of these things are variables and factors into the work that we do and put out. So to think that our biases, what we see on social media and trying to control those voices, our lived experiences, and the mainstream media, if we think for 1 second that that doesn't influence the work that we put out, then we are mistaken, because we can't help it. We are human. We're all creatures of nature. Do you have a question, Chris?
Well, actually, I just wanted to throw it out there. If anyone that is participating in this webinar has a question or comment, please consider going and writing it in the chat feature or the Q&A, so this can be a little more interactive as well.
Yes, because when we talk, we'll talk later, but if you see something that me and Daniel are not seeing, we urge you to share. I am kind of a qualitative data geek. That's something that is a result of me just kind of being that natural journalist, right? We love data. And so any data is good data, even if you agree or do not agree with what we're saying. So all of these things affect our work. It affects what we do. And we have to be mindful of those things.
So when we are mindful of these things, take a look at this. There's clearly some voices missing. If we look at these conversations and those who are in management of PR jobs, you know, the African-American women, 4.5%, even Caucasian women, 39%. Caucasian males are 48.3% of the management. Those are the ones who are making the decisions on what gets put forward, what happens, and what goes out. Nothing wrong with white males. Let me just completely say that to the beginning of the conversation. I am a true inclusionist. And when I say I'm an inclusionist, that means I believe that everybody should be included. Just because I want to be included in the conversation, it does not mean that I want to now exclude you from the conversation. If I do that, we in turn no longer have an inclusive society. We're only now switching roles, and now I become the one that's included and you become the one that's excluded. And I think that's where in our country, we've seen some of these things where we miss each other, right? We pass one another because we're not looking at the overall thing. Everybody's so busy trying to get their perspective out and they want to get their point. I'm guilty of it, right? So when I'm listening to somebody, partially listening to somebody, right? I just want to listen so I can hurry up and respond. I'm not fully listening with the intention of getting an understanding so I can have more data, as Burnea put it, right? I want more data. I want more information so I can understand where you're coming from. If I start to look at some of the plights of other individuals in these organizations, and we'll talk about some things that will help us later with empathy, but when I start to look at what I see in the place, some folks can't help it. You can't help who you are until you've identified who you are. Once you've identified who you are and now where you are. So you have to take an honest look at yourself and say, these are my core values. This is who I say I want to be. This is who we say our industry is. This is what we say we want. If this is what we want, if we want inclusion, we have to be intentional about creating inclusion. If we want to be diverse, diversity, by the way, let me just define that. And I'm sure a lot of you know, so please don't think that I am, I don't want to insult your intelligence. But when I look at diversity as the awareness of something is different, right? It's just the overall awareness. Oh, somebody has on purple hair, somebody has on different types of shoes, somebody has different color skin, different type of orientation, whatever the issue may be, whatever it is, there's a difference that's automatically recognizable, and they exist in every social system, even in groups that are monolithic. It doesn't matter. It does not matter. There's always going to be diversity, even if you know identical twins. If you know identical twins, I'm sure if you've got a relationship with them, you can tell them apart. Because if you can tell them apart, because they don't look the same when you get to know them because they have different personalities. You can easily tell them apart. But when you didn't have that information, when you didn't have that relationship, when you only had one story, which was the story that they both looked the same, you thought they looked the same until you realize each of these individuals are uniquely different. They have different personalities, and although they may dress alike, they may look alike, they are not the same. And that's why we've got to amplify more voices. If we look at the members of the organization, we need more voices in the organization of African American, Hispanic, Asian American, but we need all the people represented in these conversations so that we can have an equitable information dump, because where we are is what we're going to be. But if we only continue to tell the same stories, if we continue to look at the stories from the same perspectives, then you get it. When research comes to universities, or when grant funds are usually given out for different types of things, they're not giving them out for the studies that have been done before, right? Nobody's doing studies on black versus white. It's always been black versus white since the dawn of time. Well, now Hispanic Americans have certainly eclipsed the black population, but the narrative of the black population, with the historically slavery, coming from the history of slavery and all the other things, and Jim Crow and the years and years of continued oppression of a certain group of people, it also made other groups of individuals not be heard, understood, respected, or valued as well. So there is a danger in the single story. The danger of the single story is that you won't get the information. They say there's 3 sides to every story, right? There's your side, there's my side, and then there's what really happened. So we all have our biases. Our biases change how we look at the information that we receive. So when Burnea talked about all those different things that feed us, all of our filters that feed us, when we look at the communication spectrum, when you send me a message, you got to go through all of my filters of my life, all of the trauma of my life, and look at what I'm experiencing. So if I experience people that were negative like you, then you got to look at it. Biases are not necessarily wrong. By the way, let's just look at some information here. When we look at the bias conversation, our brains can process up to 40, consciously process 40 frames per second. You can consciously process 40 frames per second in your brain of everything that you see. However, there is something like 1.2 million pieces of information that are being cataloged into your brain every single time. So what your brain had to do, and these are established by the time you're 5 years old, what your brain had to do was find a way to create a shortcut to process certain types of information. One way to think about biases is to look at a template, or something that kind of has a specific rubric, and everything has its specific space. So that when you began to experience a conversation, or you began to visually see something, if you turn on CNN, you might have a bias there. You turn on Fox News, your bias automatically ticks up because of what you expect and how you've related to that experience in the past. And that's why, and it's not bad, or it's not good or bad, it's just the way it is. But what your brain has done is it has found a way to create a shortcut to process that information more quickly so it can be more effective. And so all of those biases for the way you see the world were shaped by the time you were 5 years old. So by the time you were 5 years old, the way you generally see things was already shaped by your environment and around you. Now, we take on other information every single day. And depending on how open you are to that information, and to new stories, and to hearing other voices, and to amplifying those other voices, it's going to determine whether you have the ability to see past the single story or not.
Thank you so much, Daniel. You bring up such a good point about bias. You know, one of the things that he talked about with the templates is that, you know, we tend to use bias as a protection mechanism. We use it to make quick judgments and quick decisions. So moving forward, let's look at some pictures of kind of what's going on today in the media. So this is a couple pictures. You can probably tell, of course, which ones are obviously from Fox and which ones are from other outlets. But look at how we paint the picture of what's going on in our society and how we can be responsible for those pictures we paint. So what's interesting, the picture right on your right, well, your right, left, right, lower side, you see that they're yelling at a police officer, right? And to them, they're justified, right? They have their right, their right to do this, right? So from one perspective, someone can look at this picture and say, well, they have a right, they want to get back to work or whatever the narrative may be. Someone with a different perspective might see this picture and then look at the picture on your top left and say, well, that treatment's not equal, right? It's not fair. And so there's always different perspectives of how we paint pictures in the media moving forward. So this is kind of what we are just inundated with over and over again, of just different media message, different images. And we have to sort through all of it. And we sort through that through the things that we mentioned earlier, which are what you've lived, the main media, the social media, just all of those different things can influence how you perceive the media, that the communication that you're receiving. So this is something that I found interesting, right? So when you're talking about what's going on in our society right now, right? We got the Black Lives Matter movement. We have All Lives Matter. We have rioting. We have protesting. We have people killing each other. But there's a lot going on, right? But this is sometimes the perspective of what people see and people of color may see, is that you see right here that you have the New York Post posting on something very similar. They did a side-by-side. So for Jacob Blake, who just got shot in the back with his kids in the car, right? They made a point to say that he had a knife in his car, right? So we have to ask ourselves, what message is that sending? And sometimes that message for people is that it was okay to shoot him because he had a knife, even though we didn't know he had a knife at first. Then you move on to Kyle Rittenhouse, who just shot and killed 2 people and injured 1, where the first thing you see about him as a white male is that he was spotted cleaning graffiti before shooting. So now we paint this image, right? These very they might be very, for some people, very done on purpose, I should say. But we're looking at this thing, and the people that we feed this media message to sometimes don't have the understanding that we have. As journalists, as communicators, as PR people, we're all probably most likely type A personalities, right? We like to control the narrative, we like to control the message, and we want others to feel that same message. So we're going to write that headline. One, we know that if it bleeds, it leads, right? So that's something that was said in our newsroom, that, hey, if it is sensational, then you got to grab. But with that sensation, what message are we sending out? Are we saying that, he deserved to be, he's a good kid, he's a white male, he's a good kid, he was cleaning graffiti, although he killed 2 people. And then do we make him the victim of his circumstances, and then make someone like Jacob Blake more of the protagonist, right? The antagonist in this story, where he deserved to get shot by the police because he had a knife, and we really don't even know the full story. The other one is right below, is comparing Kyle to Trayvon Martin, and there was traces of marijuana in his system. Well, from a perspective, from a person of color who might be looking at this, marijuana has now been made legal in certain places, and the government is wanting to get the money that marijuana offers because it's been scientifically proven that marijuana has really no death effects. It is not a gateway drug, as us who are in the media has painted that picture before years ago. And so when this was written in 2012, before we started legalizing marijuana, you paint this picture because they are trying to justify a message, right, that might not always be the truth. And we always want to hold up to the highest levels of integrity as journalists, as communicators, moving forward.
Burnea, I want to jump in here. Go back to that screen for me. I want to jump in here and really talk about the fact that when we talk about implicit bias, unconscious bias, sometimes folks don't see this. That's why we've got to include those other voices, because what I've experienced since May 2020 is that a lot of my friends, who are my friends, by the way, I've got a very eclectic group of friends. You know, I work in a nice job. I got cushy things. I have a lot of amenities and get to enjoy my life. But at the same time, I'm still a Black male in the United States. And so that means there's certain things have happened to me. I'm not a victim. I've reclaimed those things. I'm not a victim, but I have been victimized over the course of my life in certain ways. That doesn't guide me. It doesn't drive me. What it does is it drives me to find ways to change it. But what happens after George Floyd, and what people saw that was so intense, but we had just been literally glued to our TVs and glued to media and consuming media at a high rate due to COVID-19, and we were just all kind of sheltered in place. And this was a worldwide phenomenon, and so everybody was consuming media at a record pace. But then, and we saw George Floyd in that record pace media consumption, and a lot of my friends began to have those conversations with me, wondering why and where and what they could do. And everybody was having these sob stories, and I didn't know what was going on. I'm like, people were sending me emoji faces. I'm like, what's wrong with you? You know, because I don't understand why there was a problem with what happened, because it's never been a problem before, right? So all of a sudden, for me, it was something that, again, I got used to. I got used to seeing, here's another one, there's another one, whether it's right or wrong, whether it didn't, certain people everybody has certain rights that should be done, and everybody should be suspect to due process if at all possible. And so when you look at these types of situations, we have to include those voices, because it will allow us. Now, obviously, there's going to always be a bias in the story. There's always an angle. There has to be a message, and there's always going to be a call, or there should be some sort of call or purpose or reason why we're doing it, why we're writing it, etc. But at the same time, if we include other voices, it allows us the opportunity to make sure that we've told it a complete story, and make sure that we're not just steering things for the sake of clickbait and messages, but we have a responsibility to do things in an ethical and equitable way.
Yes.
And so look at go ahead, babe.
Yes. So, when we go to the next slide, we're going to look at some marketing mistakes that are probably PR's worst nightmares, right? Because you have to come up and, do crisis management, do clean up, create a different narrative, a different story, right? So the first one, we have this image, and I'm gonna let you.
Yeah. So this one was really interesting to me. Obviously, it was in the UK, but the UK suffers with the same types of issues that we did here in the United States, and to make sure that they did it. Now, once they found out, they got immediate backlash. Right now, the bottom picture would have been fine, and that's where they really should have kept it. Now, I'm thinking about H&M. And I'm thinking about I'm thinking about what I know in my construction company for marketing. Somebody has to promote that before it gets pushed out. Somebody has to go through levels. The photographer had to shoot it. Somebody had to identify that this young man was going to wear that particular piece of clothing for this picture. You could have probably put any other ethnic group into that piece, preferably a white kid if you were thinking about it. But at the same time, nobody had the information because the individuals could not have been included. And maybe if they were included, their voices were not heard or they were not empowered. We'll talk about that later. But this was a situation where there was some opportunity and it was missed, right? And yeah, the kid's mother even came up and she was defending it because he got paid. It was a job for him. But on the same time, it was a situation where it was just done in poor taste given the historical context worldwide of African Americans or Black people across the globe being attributed to primates and animals. Go ahead, Chris.
So question that Megan has is it okay to cut out or to call out the implicit bias that may not necessarily be seen by that individual, and how would you go about doing that?
Ooh.
That's a great question. And Megan, if you stick around to the end, we are going to answer that question in the steps, but I will tell you this, just in case you had to go early, that it is definitely okay. And you should feel that you have power. That's the whole purpose. That's our whole responsibility as as master communicators. It's the word that I like to use.
Burnea, let me also interject there. I also think the relationship is what dictates a lot of everything. Without a relationship, again, there was no person in the room. We presume there was no person in the room who would have helped them kind of understand the potential causes that came from this, right? If we look at, and so with the relationship occurs, and if you have that relationship with the person and you're able to effectively speak there, and you have the psychological safety with that individual, with that organization, yes, you should call it out. Now is the time. We are certainly we don't want to cancel people, because I don't want folks to be canceled. I want individuals to be empowered. And if you make a mistake, I want you to be able to adjust, adapt, and correct your mistake so that we can move forward. I like H&M. Well, when I used to be able to fit H&M's clothes, I like H&M's clothes. I like their brand. But now, so what do you do? I wasn't going to stop doing that, but I wasn't going to stop supporting H&M. But what I wanted to see is, what is their response, right? We all make mistakes. We are all human. None of us are perfect. So what do we do when we have an opportunity to call it out? And now it's becoming part of our responsibility, our social responsibility. And depending on where your core values are, you should definitely look at ways to call it out. You may have to be strategic about how you call it out, but you certainly want to look at it. You look at this Dove commercial right here. This one came out, I think this was 18. These are things that happened recently. And I used to teach on this in media, and when I was working in education, this was something that we looked at, and this wasn't out yet, but we looked at Nivea had a commercial like this, and we've seen things throughout the course of time where these types of pictures. And again, Dove recanted this very quickly, right? Because there was a bunch of folks taking off shirts and all different colors, but when you take off this one, she becomes a white woman. Like, that's what Dove soap will do for you. And that's reminiscent of something that I've seen throughout the media messages throughout our marketing history in these United States of America, where white is right, white is the best thing to be desired, and it has a white supremacist mentality. And when I say white supremacist, what I mean is the fact that white is the thing to be desired. So if you start looking at, my wife and I are always kind of looking at media and looking at how folks are being contributed on television or Netflix and movies. And you're starting to see, even in commercials now, where you're starting to see a lot of Black females who are being shown with white males, like that's the thing to attribute to. Or when you start to see Black males, one of the things I've noticed is when you start to see Black males, even if it's a strong Black figure, I have a strong personality. I intimidate people sometimes. So I'm constantly trying to find ways. I'm a muscular guy. I weigh 250 pounds. I played football back in the day. So I'm a muscular, strong guy, and I got a strong voice and I got a strong personality. So how do I soften myself up and adjust my message so that it can be received? Well, here you're looking at, when we see in media, we feel like Black is the thing to be not desired, and Black is a thing that's not the most desirable thing. Is to be desired somewhere else. Now, if that statement bothers you, that's okay. Let's talk. We love to kind of go and unpack those types of conversations, but it's just my perspective on what the media has shown me throughout the course of history of whom we should aspire to be. When I look at who are the figures that are amplified in history, when I look at the history books that were shown in my school, and I went to one of the top public schools here in the St. Louis area, and then I also went to one of the top engineering schools in the country. So when you're looking at those things, and I was always the other, I was always the asterisk, but I had certain levels of acceptance because my parents had some financial prowess. I had certain levels of acceptance because of my athletic ability, because of my speaking abilities. It got me into places where not everybody did. So what I wanted to do was use that influence to be able to adjust it. But what I found in those spaces was a lot of times folks were still not indicative of me or receiving me. I would get messages like, Dan, I don't see you as Black. And before May, a lot of folks were saying, hey, well, a lot of I wouldn't even be able to say it. I couldn't even say Black in corporate America a few months ago without kind of getting backlash, without it being kind of not whitewashed, without it being washed away by the marketing and legal teams because they thought it might bring forth legal implications. Go ahead to the next slide, Bern.
All right. So, like Dan, you said before, right? We see Dove repeating something of Pear soap, right? And you get the first step towards lightning is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness, the white man's burden, right? So these messages have historical context and continues to find itself in the DNA of what we communicate to others. Now, I told you that I was going to be honest about my bias earlier. And because of the mainstream, but more so of my lived experience as a Black woman, the picture on the bottom right of the white woman grabbing the Black girl's face, right? And all it says is PlayStation, portable white is coming, right? There had to be another way that they could say that message and get that across. But you have to realize that sometimes the messages that we send will cause trauma for some of the people with lived experiences, right? So when I see this image, the only thing I can think about is me being in broadcast journalism school, being the first Black producer in the newsroom and being treated horribly by the other producers that sat at the table. And the ability, just feeling that they wanted to have the ability to control me. And so when I see this image, you think about those things that cost you trauma. I went to a predominantly white high school, and some of the white women that I experienced, some of the teachers were mean to me. They treated me differently than all the other students. So it's trauma. And then on top of that, learning the history of my culture, right? And so as you get older, we learn more and more about slavery and the civil rights movement and redlining and all those things that's affected our community. And so now this particular angry face looking at this, what looks like a helpless Black girl, brings trauma to me. And so the message speaks a different language. That's why it's our responsibility as master communicators to make sure that we're looking at the images that we are sending, strong visual images that we have as well as other cultures, right? For instance, this one says, have a questions, we've got the answers. And you have someone who is of Asian descent who looks really goofy, is holding a bowl of rice and a phone, right? Playing to stereotypes and things like that. And that can affect the people and really make people feel excluded from the conversation. But it can also mess with your organization's money if you want business. So we have to be careful with what messages that we send.
All right, I'm gonna go through this real quick, and since for the sake of time, and I certainly want to make sure there's any responses, but recently Cobra Kai came out on Netflix, which is kind of like the reboot or kind of a spinoff of the Karate Kid series, where you've got Danny, LaRusso, who kicked, who was with Mr. Miyagi, and then you've got Johnny Lawrence, who was the bad guy, Cobra Kai. Reason why we put this on here was because in that show, what really stuck out was the fact that Johnny Lawrence is dealing with the fact that he's still stuck in 1984 when he lost the championship, and in high school, and how that affected his life. And now he's trying to move forward, and what he's having to do to move forward is he's realizing that the world around him, even though he was in it, he was still stuck in that spot. And so the world around him has moved forward. Social media, he didn't know how to use a computer and the internet, and he didn't realize that gender identities were a thing, and there were certain things that you no longer can say that are politically correct and not like that. He had not done it. He was not there. So the whole point of this is like, some folks are still stuck where they are, and it's based on where they grew up, based on their biases. But we've got to be add other stories to the conversations so that we can get that thing done. And so what happens in this show is, as other people come into his dojo, he begins to really change the way he went about it, and realizing that the way the bad boy image completely could be adapted a little bit to be a little more polished and kind of be the better version of what that was. Keep going, Burn.
Awesome. So we're gonna play, let me go back here and.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage.
Burnea, Dan, are you on? I think we dropped for some reason. I think we the 2 presenters are going to be logging back in here in just a minute. Can anybody else see or hear me? Because I think we all froze up there for a second. Can you type in the chat feature if you can hear me? All right. Yes, you can hear me. Okay, great. So hopefully both Dan and Burnea is able to log back in. I know they were showing a video there. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Dan's back here. So, and Burnea just logged on. So I'm not sure what happened there, but you guys are back with us.
Yay! I was like, oh no, what happened?
So we have a few minutes left if you want to finish up, and then we'll go into some Q&A here.
Absolutely. So let me share my screen again. So real quick, what those little things that we can do to make those changes, those small adaptions. The first one is grace. This is grace for yourself, right? You will and have made mistakes. You will make mistakes in the way you communicate, whether it's personal or whether it's on a mass scale. You will make mistakes. You have to give yourself the benefit of the doubt. We all fail. Things fail. Technology fails, like you just did. It was actually a perfect beginning into the next section, because it's something that some things we just can't control. Another is having grace for others, giving benefit of the doubt. We keep passing each other on the road, and understand that failure doesn't always mean you're going to be canceled. Case in point, Starbucks did not allow Black Lives Matters paraphernalia to be worn in their stores. And I was so disappointed. And I had to talk with my cousin, but I could not bring myself to say that I was not going to Starbucks anymore because of my addiction to Starbucks. So when they changed their PR and said, hey, you know, we do value Black lives, then hey, I was justified in continuing to to buy the coffee. My husband so desperately wants me to stop when we have coffee at home. So not all the time, right? You're not always going to be canceled, right, by the things that you put out. Give yourself some room to fail because you learn from that.
And I would say even give others that room as well, right? So when others make a mistake, allow them, especially in this diversity space, because it changes all the time, right? You know, now instead of Black people, you're supposed to say Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? That's the trending narrative. Things are changing, and with relationship comes that information. So you need to ask what you need to know, right? You have not because you ask not. Collaborate with other individuals. Find those journalism, other types of resources, other groups that may be the Black journalist groups that may be out there. My company has sponsored them before. We were supposed to sponsor them when they came here to St. Louis for their regional conference, but either way it goes, get other voices, get with your friends, ask questions and find other people. And if you don't have folks in your circle of influence, then you've got to find ways to get outside of yourself and become comfortable being uncomfortable and create those ways so you can be better. More stories, including other people's voices and stories, is what's going to help you take that step-by-step process. It's not easy. It's not a one step. It's not a one size fits all. There is no magic pill to automatically be there, but you've got to recruit other people into the conversation. Encourage people to go into it. Encourage other voices to go into media, and encourage them to be as they want to show up as themselves. Give them the psychological safety to be themselves.
Then understand the accountability measure, right? We should all, as responsible communicators, be responsible in how we communicate. We have power. We create the narrative, the story. We influence the pictures, the video, the visuals, and what people see. Know that you do have that influence, and be responsible. Know your blind spots. And you need other people for blind spots. We all need each other to see the things that we just don't see. That's how you avoid mistakes such as, you know, the coolest monkey in the jungle, or Dove, you know, taking off a shirt, becoming Black to white. You avoid those things because you include those voices. And make sure that you're not scared. And, you know, we had the question earlier, right? And I told her I would get back to this if you're still here. You know, we have a fear, right? We fear people's responses, retaliation, judgment. We fear all those things. But what I want you to do is, going back to those core values, is to match your core values. And that will help you overcome your fear every time. It is the culture, it is the thing that you believe in that's going to help you become a responsible communicator and communicate those things responsibly.
And and we finish up with this. Empathy is Brene Brown, who I love, by the way. You look her up. She does tons of great talks, tons of TED Talks. She works at the University of Houston. But cultural trauma, realizing that we are a summation of our experiences. So be empathetic to those folks where, you know, kind of like what we saw in Katrina, where one person was looting the stores and the white male was trying to feed their family, right? Let's just be a little more empathetic to one another and find a way to see where their side is. Again, asking those questions to get more information with an empathic response. I may not understand it, but I certainly can understand from how you've identified it to me why that might be problematic for you. And I thank you for sharing that with me. The psychological safety is that, right? It's the allowing the environment to be able to be yourself, the ability for one to say who they are, where they are, and how they are, and know that they're not going to be ridiculed, they're not going to be done about it. Google did a 10-year study called Project Aristotle on this that basically said that psychological safety is the #1 thing that teams need to function effectively. All right. And then we're looking at the data versus the stories, right? There's stories out there that steer narratives, but we always got to use data. Data can be skewed any way it could be, but the data is the data. And so we use data to steer the stories, but oftentimes stories are filled with emotions. And so we discredit them. But at the same time, the story is the real story. So even though people are trying to say that, you know, well, there's no data that shows that police use lethal force more than another time with Black folks versus others, that's not the story, and that's certainly not the perceived experience. So we have to really deal with the perception, because perception is reality, even though it may not be the truth. And last thing but not least, learning how to become comfortable being uncomfortable, engaging in the space when you're in uncomfortable places, that creates the opportune environment for all of us to grow. So engage into the discomfort, be uncomfortable, because if you look at any time in your life, especially when you were physically growing, we all had growing pains. And so we grow when we have pain, but we know that we're growing. So use that as an opportunity to do that and go from here. What you guys saw today was a small thing that just a small bit of what we do at the Art of Adaption. And we're just glad to be able to talk to you. So please feel free to give us any questions or send them to Chris, and he will send us to us. We thank you for your time and your attention.
Well, Daniel and Burnea, thank you so much for being here today. This was truly an amazing and eye-opening presentation. And I know we have several people that are on here that are D&I really champions throughout the country. In fact, I know Patrick McSweeney, who's on here, they won the PRSA D&I National Award last year. And Nez Savala, and we have a number of other people from all over the place that are still on board. And
Awesome.
We're going to present this to them on our YouTube channel. So you can share this to other people if you're still watching. But I would like to turn it over to Bridget in Kansas City. If you'd like to take yourself off mute, and there you go. Go ahead, Bridget.
Hi.
Bridget.
Hi. Thank you so much for today's presentation. It was very good. You know, I mean, it's messages that we all need to be reminded of and be aware of. I work at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and we have a nice team of communicators putting out messages, and our audience is very diverse. So we need to make sure that we're talking to the people that that are representative. So thank you very much.
Well, Bridget, you know, you are my sister school. I work at UMSL as the Evaluation and Learning Manager for our Community Innovation and Action Center. So I'm always listening to community voices. So, hey, feel free to find me in our network, right?
I will.
And connect.
So it's kind of funny. I always say that PRSA, the Public Relations Society of America, is a great organization because networking with people is what it's all about. It's about building your personal relationships. And we never would have had this unless I had the interaction with Dan 10 years ago. And we've remained friends ever since on social media and interacting every so often. So one of the great things about PRSA is you do make those connections. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And feel free to watch this again on YouTube. So thank you, guys. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We enjoyed being here. It's what we do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Goodbye.